Welcome back to another episode of War in Cali. The East Coast Crips are one of the most active gangs in Los Angeles County. They went to war with several gangs, from Crips, Hoovers, Bloods, and Southsiders. One old rival who started off as an ally was F-13, a set also big with numbers and very active throughout Los Angeles County. Both gangs have a huge territory, and some of their turf is basically shared, making many members grow up together. There's many reasons stated why they began the beef. Many state a drug deal gone wrong, and since that deal, many gang members on both sides have lost their lives, as well as many innocent people.
And what's especially disturbing is a growing number of innocent people are dying in what one detective describes as absolute genocide going on. Within this 3-square-mile area in South Central, there have been as many as 36 murders and more than 100 shootings since January of last year. All of them connected to an East Coast Florencia gang war.
They've been dropping like flies, man.
Here at this hangout for a Florencia clique called the Assassins.
Assassins, AS, 69th Street and Hooper.
No one is making any apologies.
If you gotta do it, you gotta do it.
All right,
You gotta do what you gotta do. They drop one of us, we drop two of them. They drop two of us, we drop three of them fools. That's the way it is, you know?
Yeah.
So trying to survive out here, man.
No one in this Florencia group will discuss details about what started the killings, but this East Coast gangster says it can be summed up in a word.
Drugs. Starts off with drugs. We was getting short on our connections, so we decided to go rob these people and get some dope. And that's what it really jumped off at.
Informants tell Fox 11 News the Mexican mafia is now pressing all Florencia cliques to seek revenge for the stolen drugs. So there's a chain reaction.
It's black on brown, brown on black, and it's a continual back and forth.
And gangsters confirm what started out as a feud over drugs and money has in fact become a straight-out race war.
Death was common between the two, and that leads us to this story. So let's get into this case. On August 14th, 2019, at approximately 1:44 a.m., the Los Angeles Police Department responded to a call reporting shots fired at the intersection of 61st Street and Broadway in Los Angeles. The responding officers found X-Ray, an East Coast Crip member, on the ground. He was suffering from gunshot wounds to the head and leg. Shortly after, he was pronounced dead. There were no bullet casings at the crime scene. That suggested to officers that the shooter used a revolver. LAPD obtained surveillance footage of the shooting, and a video obtained from 6125 South Broadway showed the shooter's vehicle at the intersection of Broadway and 61st Street about 13 or 14 minutes before the shooting. The vehicle appeared to be a Nissan Altima. A light-colored object was visible on the dashboard near the center console. The vehicle had scratch marks above the right wheel. Another video obtained from 6225 South Broadway showed the same vehicle driving back towards the same intersection around 1:42 a.m. A third video obtained from 251 West 61st Street showed the victim walking out of a motel wearing the same clothing found at the crime scene. The vehicle entered the intersection of Broadway and 61st Street and then stopped. The rear passenger door opened and an individual stepped out the vehicle and began to fire multiple rounds at the victim. X-Ray then fell onto the corner of 62nd Street and Broadway. There were two red lights visible in the video footage next to X-Ray, which suggested that the laser was attached to the shooter's gun. The center brake light of the shooter's vehicle was not working at the time of the shooting. At 1:43 a.m., the LAPD received a call that somebody in a Nissan Altima on 61st Street and Broadway had just shot the caller's friend. Later that day, a police officer pulled over a man named George in a Nissan Altima. The police retrieved 2 cell phones, one from the car and one from George. The officer noticed that one of the brake lights on the vehicle was not working. George's vehicle was then impounded. A detective inspected and searched George's car, and there was damage to the front and rear passenger doors and the rear fender. The scratches above the right car wheel were consistent with those seen in the surveillance video. Data was also extracted from the cell phone found on George. There was a photo of a revolver that had an attached laser. The cell phone internet search history included searches of firearms with lasers. There was also a photo and video taken a day before the shooting showing George holding a revolver-type gun and pointing it at the camera. On August 8, 2019, days before the shooting, police conducted a traffic stop. George was the driver, and he was driving a Nissan Altima. George wore a Atlanta Falcons cap, which was commonly used for F-13 gang members. A photo on George's phone showed him throwing up the letters F to rep his gang. and also another person in the photo with George throwing up the number 3. Autopsy photos and x-rays show that he had 2 tattoos of the letter F on his cheek, one upright and the other upside down, meaning, fuck F-13. The victim also had tattoos of East Coast on his face. Shortly after George was arrested, the police placed an undercover informant posing as a fellow inmate in George's cell and secretly recorded their conversation. The informant was older than George, who was 20 years old at the time. He represented himself as a fellow gang member. He was paid $1,500 and was briefed on the circumstances of the case beforehand. George told the informant that he was a member of F-13 and that the victim was an East Coast Crip. George said the police didn't have a gun or nothing, just his car. When the informant asked about the shell casings, George responded that the firearm was a revolver and police didn't even know what type. George told the informant that his fellow gang member known as Bad Boy, who was also involved in the shooting, took off. Later, George said the victim's gang retaliated after the shooting by killing someone on his block. After that, they had a long dialogue. The informant first asked, "Was that fool young that y'all guys got?" George says yes. That's why the East Coast Crips came back so fast. The informant continued asking, did X-Ray bang on George when it happened? George said yeah. The informant said, oh seriously? And that fool threw it up? George said yeah. The informant said, you were like alright? George said, he was like, what up cuz? And then boom. Informant said, he said that to you? George said, yeah man. When George returned to his cell, one of the detectives said to him, I'm going to tell you, I haven't seen a lot of revolvers with a laser. The informant then asked George several questions about the laser and then the revolver used in the shooting. The informant asked how much that crap costs. Are they expensive? Do they sell them or do they put them together separate? George replied, it was already put together. In response to a question about the price, George said he bought it for like $250. George explained when you put your finger on the trigger of the revolver, the laser turns on by itself. When asked if he sold the revolver, George stated, hopefully, the homie got rid of it already. George and the informant continued to have a long convo, which George questioned how did the police know anything, which the informant also stated, how would they know? But this was all the police needed. George was later sentenced to 25 years to life for this crime. X-Ray was the last East Coast Crip killed in this brutal war between the East Coast Crips and F-13. Shortly after his death, in series of months of meetings and ceasefires, a peace treaty happened between both gangs that's still active, with both gangs being on good terms, and hopefully it stays that way. RIP all lost in this war. This will conclude this episode. If you haven't already, check out my previous episodes. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.